Hello, this is review number 10. This is our last review, and it's entitled 1960s Onward. Okay, we start with Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan in 1961 wrote The Feminine Mystique. And what she did was she interviewed several thousand college students and found that many of these college students, many of these college women were kind of wondering, is this all there is to life? I'm going to graduate and then I'm not going to be able to use my degree. And am I really going to be relegated to a life of being a housewife? And what she also found out was that many women were not satisfied in doing that. The quote, "Sisterhood is power, the personal is political," belongs in the 1960s. When we start talking about women's rights, it really starts in the 1960s. Certainly, we've talked about it before. We've gone back to Seneca Falls. We talked about it in the 1880s, 1890s. Certainly, we talked about it coming up to 1919 and the 19th Amendment. And so we've certainly talked about it before, but whenever you think about women's rights, you should really think about, in the women's movement, you should really think about the 1960s into the 1970s. The 1960 election, this was between JFK and Nixon. This is important for a couple different reasons. First of all, JFK is going to be our first Catholic president. He is not the first Catholic to run for president, but he's going to be the first Catholic to win. This is the first presidential election where TV plays a major role. Here we have the first televised debates between Nixon and JFK, and JFK comes off much better on television than Nixon does. The New Frontier is Kennedy's domestic program. It does not have a faction of civil rights to it. Remember, Kennedy cannot really push for civil rights until after 1964 and after he's reelected. If he pushes for civil rights before 1964, he is not going to get reelected in 1964. So the New Frontier is dedicated to helping the poor, is dedicated to raising up low-income families. It also, part of the New Frontier is included with the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is where once you graduate college for a couple years, you can travel across the world and to some third world country and help them maybe dig a well or education or help farmers with new techniques. The idea is to help these third world nations so they don't fall into communism. Alliance for Progress. Alliance for Progress is really meant to be the Marshall Plan for Latin America. If you remember what the Marshall Plan is, Marshall Plan was $12 billion to help rebuild Western European countries after World War II in order to stop the spread of communism. And the Marshall Plan worked. We rebuilt factories, we rebuilt roads and hospitals and schools. And if you remember, no place that got Marshall Plan money fell to communism. Well, Kennedy thought we could do the same thing in Latin America. If we invest in Latin America, if we send money down to Latin America, then they can build factories, they can build roads, schools, and hospitals. But the problem is it didn't work. The money wound up in the hands of dictators. Dictators then used that money to build up their militaries to protect themselves because they were torturing and killing their own people. Bay of Pigs invasion. This is the invasion right after Castro takes power, and it was planned under Eisenhower, but the plan went forth under Kennedy. It turns out to be a huge disaster, a huge political disaster for Kennedy and the United States. And Castro says, of course, how dare America plot to overthrow Castro? How dare the United States plot to take over Cuba? Because of this, though, JFK looks very, very weak in the eyes of the Soviets, and it gives Khrushchev that confidence to go forward with what he wants to do. Shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion, we had the Berlin Wall go up. This is August of 1961, so things are going very, very quickly under Kennedy's administration. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. I remember we had spy planes flying over Cuba, and we see that the Soviets are building missile silos in Cuba. So we decide to put a blockade around Cuba, and if the Soviets would cross that blockade, that meant World War III, that meant nuclear war. Well, we come within visual distance of the Soviet ships. They wind up turning back and going back to the Soviet Union. Now, because of this, we promise to leave Castro alone. We promise not to try to take over Cuba anymore. And at the same time, the Soviet Union promises to pull their missiles out of Cuba. The OAS it stands for Organization of American States. The purpose behind this is the idea of peace in the Western Hemisphere. Not much is really accomplished by this, but what we see again, trying to get along with Latin American countries, trying to treat them kind of on an equal basis, but certainly better than we have before. Martin Luther King and letters from a Birmingham jail. What was the purpose of that? To support the Black Panthers, to get the NAACP to join in, to outline civil disobedience as a form of protest. Letters from a Birmingham jail, it outlines civil disobedience. This idea that we can protest without violence, that if somebody raises a hand to you, you don't raise a hand back. Cesar Chavez, when you think about Hispanics in North America, when you think about Hispanic immigration into the United States, most of these people are migrant farm workers, and none of these migrant farm workers are unionized. And so they are working for whatever they can make, and most of the time that is very, very little money. So Cesar Chavez comes in, and he forms the United Farm Workers, basically union, to help farm laborers, to help give them a higher wage for their migrant farm work. Who painted a picture of Marilyn Monroe, soup cans, etc.? This is where sometimes AP gets a little silly, because they will ask you about some art and who might the artist be, and of course the test is in black and white, and so oftentimes these pictures don't translate very well. Well, in this case, there was a picture of Marilyn Monroe, there was a picture of soup cans, and you just kind of needed to know that was Andy Warhol. So two very famous paintings by Andy Warhol. Unfortunately, those pictures really depend on some color as well. Silent Spring. Silent Spring was written by Rachel Carson. This is really the first environmental book. It talks about anti-pesticides, especially DDT, and the idea that we're spreading DDT over crops and then selling it to the American public, and DDT was found later to cause cancer. The 1960s civil rights legislation, really, JFK, like we said before, did very little with civil rights, because if he pushes for civil rights before 1964, he's not going to get reelected. His successor, though, Lyndon Johnson, does do a lot with civil rights. He passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlaws segregation in public places. He passes the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to protect voting rights throughout the entire United States, but specifically the South. And he also passes the 24th Amendment, which outlaws poll taxes. 1960s civil rights leader, which is not paired correctly. Okay, this is kind of a difficult one because we have to start knocking off ones that we know. Malcolm X and the Black Muslims, Stokely Carmichael and the SNCC, Marcus Garvey and the SCLC, or Huey Newton and the Black Panthers. Okay, well, let's start knocking off a couple that we know. Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, we should know. That was in that video in 1968 that we watched. Malcolm X and the Black Muslims, that again, we should be able to knock that one off. The other two that we're going to have to kind of guess, maybe flip a coin. Stokely Carmichael and the SNCC, it's a Students for Nonviolent Committee. That is paired correctly, so the correct answer is Marcus Garvey and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Lyndon Johnson and civil rights laws, its significance because he is a Southerner, he is a Texan, and so he is pushing for really a lot of these civil rights laws in what he calls the Great Society. Remember, the Great Society expands on the new frontier, expands on what Kennedy wants to do. But Johnson, after Kennedy is assassinated, Johnson's able to stand up in front of a very Republican Congress and say, in the name of our slain president, let's go ahead and pass all of the new frontier policies that Kennedy wanted. And so he got all of the new frontier passed, plus a lot of things of his own. Great Society, what is not a part of it? The answer here is Social Security Act. And again, we talked about, when we were talking about the New Deal, you have to know some of these big things and when they happen. Social Security Act happens under the New Deal. Other things happen under the Great Society. Civil Rights Act, National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, Higher Education Act, Medicare, and HUD all happen under the Great Society. Malcolm X, he is associated with the black Muslims. He is much like Booker T. Washington. We talked about Booker T. Washington. I'm sorry, not Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois demanded equal and immediate treatment by whites, and not like Booker T. Washington, where Washington said, if we just do our best and we prove to whites that we're worthy of equal treatment, they will give us equal treatment. So Malcolm X can really be compared to W.E.B. Du Bois. And Malcolm X was assassinated in 65. Remember, MLK was assassinated in 68. Why was Lyndon Johnson elected in 64? He is really seen as the heir to JFK. Now, JFK is much more popular dead than he was alive. But once he is assassinated, he becomes a favorite politician for a lot of people. He represented the youth of America. He represented the excitement of America. And so, and he, in some ways, represented progressiveness in America. And so, Lyndon Johnson is kind of the heir to Kennedy. He's also a terrific politician. He's been around politics for a long time. He knows how the game is played, and so he knows how to get some things done. Before the election of 64, LBJ portrays his opponent, Barry Goldwater, as a warmonger. Hey, if you vote for Barry Goldwater, we're going to get into Vietnam for sure. Well, it turns out that shortly after the election of 64, we get involved in the Vietnam War, to the extent that it's eventually called Johnson's War. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is August of 1964. Remember what happens here in the Gulf of Tonkin. This is just off the coast of North Vietnam. Two of our patrol boats are attacked by the North Vietnamese, and Johnson uses this as a reason to get Congress to sign the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gives the president widespread power to do whatever he thinks is necessary in Vietnam to stop further aggression. Eventually, Johnson is going to use this to send over 500,000 American troops into Vietnam to do a massive bombing campaign in North Vietnam. Vietnam War cartoon. Generally, you'll see the cartoon is usually a cartoon about Lyndon Johnson, and you can always tell Lyndon Johnson because he has a huge, huge nose, and kind of this old guy with just this big nose. And so usually what we see is a tank and with maybe wheels or treads made of money. And what it's saying is we're spending so much time and money on the Vietnam War that we don't have any money left for the Great Society programs. Which is not true about the United States in Vietnam. Okay, the United States occupied North Vietnam. That was not the case. We invaded North Vietnam a lot, but we never occupied all of North Vietnam. The United States helped to set up the South Vietnam government. That is true. The United States soldiers fought alongside South Vietnamese troops. That is also true. So the answer is United States occupied North Vietnam. Sit-ins. The purpose of sit-ins in the 1960s, especially as we get into the late 1960s, is to protest the Vietnam War. Hundreds of students, sometimes on campuses, sometimes in public, would just sit down and force police to arrest them. What they're doing is to get the media attention and to hopefully spark debate in Congress throughout the United States about the purpose of Vietnam. What did the Tet Offensive prove? It proved that no matter how many troops we have, by this time, this is 1968, we have over 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and we cannot even protect the cities in South Vietnam. Remember, Tet, North Vietnamese came down and attacked every major city in South Vietnam. Tet did what? Attacked all cities in South Vietnam on the Vietnamese New Year. That's what Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. Why was 1968 a watershed year? A watershed year means that things are different than they were just before that year. And so in this case, 1968, there's a lot going on. There's a very active presidential campaign. There are assassinations. We have Robert Kennedy assassinated. We have Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated. We have a moon landing or in 1960, or actually at the very end of 1968, on the first week of 1969. We have all sorts of protests going on. We have campuses being shut down. Some of those protests are very, very violent. So there are lots of things going on in 1968. 1968 is also the top year that we're in Vietnam as far as how many troops we have in Vietnam. And so, like I said, lots of things in 1968. All of this happened in 1968 except the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., yes, that happened in April. The Tet Offensive happens in January. The assassination of Robert Kennedy, yes. The assassination of Malcolm X, that did not happen. That happened in 1965, 3 years earlier. My Lai Massacre, yes. And violent demonstrations at the Democratic Party convention in Chicago, that is also true. Why did LBJ run for re-election in 1968? He runs, or he did not run, because he is very unpopular. Remember, just 3 years before this, when he ran in 1964, he was so popular, he wins by the largest popular vote ever, by 25 million votes. Less than 4 years later, he decides not to even run because he is so hated by the American public. And so he steps aside and allows other people to run. The person who is eventually going to get the Democratic nomination is Hubert Humphrey, his vice president. Why did Nixon get support in 1968 regarding the war? Nixon said he was going to turn the war over to the Vietnamese, that he was going to get America out of the war. Now, it happens, but really not until almost 1968 is when he starts pulling troops out, or right before the election in 68. So he starts pulling troops out in October. The election is in November. Why did Nixon have a head start in 1968 for the 68 election? Because the Democrats were split on the war. Most of the Democrats were anti-war. Some Democrats, like Hubert Humphrey, was for winning the Vietnam War. RFK was killed, and he looks like he's going to be a contender for the Democratic nomination. And so once he is killed, all of a sudden the Democrats have to figure out somebody else to run, and that's going to be Hubert Humphrey. And of course, Humphrey's problem is that he is tied to Lyndon Johnson, and as we just said, Lyndon Johnson was very, very unpopular by the time we get to 1968. Between 65 and 69, the bulk of the war, we go from the Americanization of the war to the Vietnamization of the war. Americanization of the war means that Americans are doing most of the fighting in Vietnam. Vietnamization of the war is starting in about 1967 into 1968. We are turning more and more of the Vietnam War over to the Vietnamese. So that allows America to leave Vietnam. What did Nixon stop during his administration? He stopped sending troops to South Vietnam and pulled troops out of South Vietnam. The Nixon Doctrine just said, listen, we will help countries stay free from communism. We will give them supplies. We will give them we'll give them training, but we are not going to do all the fighting. For countries fighting against communism, they are going to have to do most of the heavy lifting. They're going to have to do most of the work to keep their own countries free. My Lai, the My Lai Massacre. My Lai was a village in North Vietnam, actually in South Vietnam. American troops went in there under the command of Lieutenant Kelly, and by the time they were done in that village, tensions rose, and all of a sudden people started shooting, and a couple of hundred Vietnamese citizens were killed. So not only men, but also women and children killed in the village of My Lai, which again, this is 1968, and Americans are asking, why are we in Vietnam? We can't protect the cities, and now we're killing women and children in Vietnam, so why are we there? Vietnam, why are we invading Cambodia? Why are we bombing Cambodia? Remember, we're bombing both Cambodia and Laos because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail goes from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. the North Vietnamese can make those quick strikes into South Vietnam and then go back into Cambodia and be safe. Well, under Nixon, Nixon widens the war into Cambodia and starts bombing that Ho Chi Minh Trail. Because he does this, there are lots and lots of protests across the country. Here Nixon is expanding the war, and remember, he runs and wins in 1968 on the promise that he is going to limit the war, or he's going to pull American troops out of Vietnam, and now he's expanding. One of the places, actually two of the places that fall under intense protests, one is Kent State in Ohio, and the other one is Jackson State in Mississippi. In both cases, the National Guard is sent in, people start shooting, several students are dead, and again, people in the United States are saying, why are we in Vietnam again? First, we can't protect the cities. Now, then we started shooting women and children in Vietnam, and now we're killing American students. So what exactly are we doing? How did the United States get out of the Vietnam quagmire? A lot of times on AP exams, you are going to see words that you just don't quite understand. And quagmire is probably one of them. We're going to talk about another one here in just a little bit called nadir. Quagmire is exactly how it sounds. It sounds kind of muddy, it sounds kind of sticky, and that's what a quagmire is. We get into Vietnam without any real plan of how do we get out of Vietnam. And so Nixon's plan to get out of Vietnam, like we talked about, is this gradual withdrawal from Vietnam. How did the United States' involvement in Vietnam end? Gradual phase out of troops. We've gone over that now 3 times. The War Powers Act. The War Powers Act is really signed after Watergate, and trying to limit the president's power in where he can send troops and how long those troops can stay. Because of the War Powers Act, the president has the power to send troops wherever he wants to for 60 days. After 60 days, he needs the approval of Congress to keep those troops there. Now, most of the times, in fact, I think every single time, the president has been able to keep troops there until he sees fit to bring them home. But he still needs that approval by Congress. Détente, this is under Nixon, and what détente really means is an easing of tensions. And an easing of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. We are going to try to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons between those two countries. We are trying to stop this idea of brinkmanship, running up to the brink of nuclear war and then pulling back. And so trying to do things to reduce the tensions between those two superpowers. New federalism. New federalism is another word for revenue sharing. And what revenue sharing was states would get a chunk of money from the federal government. And each state then was to use that money to get people back to work. And ideally to pull people out of poverty. Well, what really happened was once states got this federal money, politicians, mainly the governor of each state, then had the power to decide how that money was used. And instead of using that money to get people back to work and to train people to get better jobs or for low-income housing or any program to get people back on their feet, politicians, mainly governors, use that money to direct that money toward what's going to benefit the middle class, because it's the middle class who's going to vote. And so all of a sudden we start building parks, we start building youth centers, we start building YMCAs, all of which are great things, but none of which are actually helping poor people get back to work. Watergate. Watergate, of course, is Nixon's demise. Nixon was incredibly paranoid. Without Watergate, Nixon probably goes down as one of our better presidents, especially with his foreign policy. He does wind up getting us out of Vietnam. The economy does start to turn around under Nixon, but Watergate is certainly his major issue. The Watergate Hotel was the center for the Democratic National Committee, and this is where all the plans are being made to run against Nixon in 1972. So the organization called CREEP, every president has this organization, the Committee to Re-elect the President. Under that organization, CREEP, there was a secret group called the Plumbers. They break into the Watergate Hotel several times. They wind up being caught. It turns out that Nixon knows the entire thing. There are several tapes that tie Nixon to the Watergate break-in. And so Nixon winds up having to resign because of Watergate. Now, oftentimes people want to say that Nixon was impeached. Nixon was never impeached. He was going to be impeached, but just before he was, he resigned the presidency. Nixon impeachment, why were there impeachment charges? What were the charges? First of all, obstruction of justice, contempt of Congress, and finally, misuse of federal agencies. 1970s women gained rights through all the following except. Okay, this is kind of a strange question. So let's go through the possible choices and we'll talk about it and we'll try to forget the question. 1970s women gained rights through all the following except. Miss Magazine doesn't really give women rights. It's a career woman magazine. It's dedicated to encouraging women to have careers. Equal Rights Amendment, remember, it doesn't really give women rights. The amendment is never passed. Roe versus Wade does give women rights. It gives women the right to an abortion. So the answer, without that word except in there, the answer should be Roe versus Wade. And then the next one is equally as confusing. Roe versus Wade and blank. We're not sure what the rest of that sentence was. Oftentimes what happens is you guys come back from the AP exam, you're all excited, you try to tell us what the questions are and whatever else, and sometimes you don't quite get the questions totally correct. So anyway, Roe versus Wade has one in common. Well, Roe versus Wade deals with privacy, the right to women's privacy. And the two amendments here that apply are the 14th Amendment, protects personal liberty, but also the 9th Amendment, anything not granted specifically to the federal government is a personal right. And so those are the two major amendments that affect Roe versus Wade. All in the Family. All in the Family was a TV show in the 1970s, getting into the early 1980s. All in the Family featured the Bunker family, and Archie Bunker, the main character, was extremely racist. He was extremely sexist, and it was poking fun at all these things going on in America, poking fun at racism, poking fun at sexism, poking fun at the radical hippies, poking fun at all these different things going on in the 1970s. To kind of mix up the pot a little bit, he had a black neighbor, he had a Puerto Rican neighbor. His daughter was a feminist, and so all these different things really kind of upset Archie Bunker. And so every once in a while you'll see a reference to All in the Family, the TV show. It's a very, very important show in American history. Jimmy Carter's foreign policy. He tries to do a bunch of different things, and quite a few of them fail. So let's take a look. First of all, SALT II. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The first one is signed under Nixon. That passes. That actually does reduce nuclear weapons, both with the Soviet Union and the United States. SALT II does not pass. Remember, we were just about to sign it, and then 1980, and the Soviets invade Afghanistan. So we decide maybe now is not a good time to cut back on our military. Camp David Accords. This is actually Carter's shining moment as president. This peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. Israel gives up some land. Egypt promises not to attack Israel anymore. Or the Iran hostage crisis. This is a disaster for Carter. The Ayatollah Khomeini takes over the American embassy and holds American hostages for well over a year, 444 days. And then the Panama Canal. Most Americans do not like this agreement with Panama turning over the Panama Canal in 1999, so about 20 years later. Camp David Accords, what did it do? It settled open violence between Israel and Egypt. And remember, this goes back to Nixon and the interim agreement, which solved the first oil embargo. And because of that first oil embargo, we agreed to help both the Arabs and the Israelis. And at the same time, we also commit ourselves to brokering peace treaties between Israel and its neighbors. And the Camp David Accords are the first of those peace treaties. What did the Soviets do during Carter's administration? They invaded Afghanistan. And remember, the Soviets had been relatively peaceful for a good 20 years or so before this. And then all of a sudden they invade Afghanistan. and of course they look a lot more militaristic, and which leads us to have to pour more money into our military right at the time where we can't afford to because of the economy. Carter's domestic policy started a trend toward regulation of industry. Okay, again, we need to figure out what political party are these people. It's so important that you know these political parties, because generally Democrats are not going to, or actually are going to, regulate industry as much as they can. Now, Carter is going to be the exception to this. Carter is not going to do a whole lot to regulate industries. The deregulation of industry, and Carter's certainly not going to do that as a Democrat. He is not going to deregulate industry, pull regulation away from industry. So the answer here is humanitarian reform. Carter is known as one of our most humanitarian presidents. He tells countries, if you kill and torture your own people, we will not do business with you. And so it winds up hurting our economy, but it's certainly a change from the from the foreign policy that we've had before, where generally we don't care if you kill or torture your own people, as long as you're pro-American. The worst aspect of Carter's administration, he is seen as an outsider, which is one of the reasons why he gets elected, because he's from Georgia and he has nothing to do with Watergate. But he's seen as an outsider. He's seen as incompetent because all these different issues pop up and he doesn't have any real good solution for them. It doesn't seem like he has any agenda. He doesn't have any direction for the country. And the big thing for Carter is that Iran hostage crisis. He is really powerless to act on that. He does try to send a couple of helicopters into Iran to rescue these people, but those helicopters wind up crashing in the Iranian desert, and that turns out to be a huge failure for Carter. Declining U.S. esteem in foreign affairs reached a nadir with. Okay, again, what does that word mean, nadir? Nadir in this case means a low or a lull. So declining U.S. esteem in foreign affairs reached a dramatic low with the boycott of the Moscow Olympics. No, not really. The Iran hostage crisis, that's our answer. The end of war in Afghanistan, that really has very little to do with us. So the Iran hostage crisis is Carter's low point in his presidency. Who was a human rights president? We already talked about Carter. Why did Carter freeze Iranian assets in the United States? Because of hostages. Once they take our hostages, Iran had lots of assets in the United States that we freeze. What that means is we don't allow Iran to have those, to have that money that they have invested in the United States. What did President Carter and President Reagan have in common besides simply being human? And on the surface, that's what all it looks like they have in common. Carter is very, very liberal. Reagan is very, very conservative. And so what did they have in common? The answer here is they are both Washington outsiders. You need to know that Carter was a governor in Georgia, and Ronald Reagan was a governor in California before becoming president. Neither one were in Congress. Neither one were politicians in Washington, D.C. before becoming president. The goal of the Reagan administration was to really lower taxes to stimulate the economy. Reagan is going to call this trickle-down economics. He says if we cut income taxes, that is really going to help the wealthy, and then the wealthy is going to use those savings and taxes to expand businesses, to create more jobs, to hire more people. People will have jobs. We've talked about this before. They will have more money then because they have jobs. They will pay in taxes, plus they will buy stuff, which will help stimulate the economy. Reaganomics, also known as trickle-down economics, also known as voodoo economics. Voodoo economics comes from George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, who's the first George Bush, and winds up as Ronald Reagan's vice president. Now, as George H.W. Bush is running against Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination, George Bush takes a look at this trickle-down economics, and he says, this is never going to work. We've tried this before. This is never going to work. But Americans latch on to this idea of trickle-down economics. The Reaganomics, so we already talked about that. The idea of lowering taxes to stimulate the economy. The Iran-Contra scandal, if you remember, this is the scandal under Ronald Reagan. Uh, Remember, after Vietnam, it is now illegal to sell weapons to these freedom fighters, these people who appear to be fighting against communism throughout the world. And uh, so what happens is we send weapons over to Iran, and the idea is they're going to release some hostages, and then they are supposed to send money to back to the United States. They're supposed to pay for these weapons, these anti-tank missiles. They're supposed to send money back to the United States. Instead, that money gets diverted to a group called the Contras in Nicaragua. Now, the Contras are this freedom fighting group fighting against the communist group called the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Well, this diversion of money was illegal. Again, it was against the law for Americans to fund any of these freedom fighters fighting against communism throughout the world. And so the question is, how did this money get sent, or who ordered this money to be sent from Iran to Nicaragua? Well, the person who gets tagged for this is a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. He takes the blame for it, but many people believe that Ronald Reagan, that President Reagan, knew everything about it and actually ordered that money to be transferred to the Contras. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States population is growing with immigration from these two different groups of people. Again, whenever we talk about immigration, we always have to think about what time period are we talking about. If we're talking about the early 1600s, it's mainly from England, some from France, some from Spain. If we're talking about the 1840s, we're really talking about Irish and German. If we're talking about the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, into the 1900s, we're really talking about Eastern and Southern Europeans. Then, if we're talking about really from 1970 onward, it's Latin America and Asia. About 45% of our immigrants are coming from Latin America, and about 30% of our immigrants are coming from Asia. And so certainly we have switched to not only the Western Hemisphere, but also Asia. Bill Clinton. Why was Bill Clinton impeached? Bill Clinton was impeached because he lied under oath, perjury. And remember, he is the second president to be impeached. And the first president was Andrew Johnson, right after Lincoln. He was found not guilty by a single vote. It was not that close with Clinton. You need 2/3 vote in Congress to actually find a president guilty. And Congress was about 50-50. It went down political lines. So about 50% voted not guilty, 50% voted guilty. Almost all the Republicans voted not guilty, and almost all the Democrats voted not guilty. Perjury. He lied under oath about his affair with Monica Lewinsky. Okay, that is where our notes stop. Now, understand there's more after this. Obviously, there's President Bush. There's then of course President Obama. So there's a lot of stuff that happens after Clinton. But the things that we do during our review in class will cover that stuff. All right, let's take a look at our dates again. The first category goes in order. The Berlin Wall is built in 1961. The Berlin Wall comes down in 1989. Number 3, the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Remember why that is broken up. We simply outspend the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan really takes out the American credit card and we buy military items, tanks and ships and airplanes and bombs, and tanks and ships and airplanes and bombs, and we just simply outspend the Soviet Union. We could afford to go into debt much more than the Soviet Union could, and there are people who were starving to death, and so they had to pull away from all this military spending and start taking care of their own people. Okay, so the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Desert Storm in 1991. The second category, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. Number 2, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 64. Number 3, the first Watts riots in 65. And number 4, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in 1969. The next category, Malcolm X is assassinated in 65. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in 68. Robert Kennedy is assassinated in June of 68. 2 months after Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in April, Robert Kennedy is assassinated in June. And then Kent State University shooting in 1970. And our final category, Nixon visits China in 1972. Number 2, Nixon visits Russia in 72, later on that year. Number 3, Nixon resigns from the presidency in 74. And then number 4, Saigon is taken by the North Vietnamese in 75. All right. So, wars. Let's quickly go over these wars. It says put an asterisk next to those wars with overwhelming U.S. support of the war. All right, most of these wars, even the Revolutionary War, it is hard to pin down. Did it actually have widespread United States support? There are only really 2 slam bang ones that are widespread, that have widespread U.S. support, and even those have detractors. The first one, of course, that has widespread American support is World War II. Most Americans, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, most Americans are on board with getting into the war against the Axis powers. The second one that has widespread support, public support, the Spanish-American War. Now, even with that, there are a group of people, mainly mainly farmers, who are not real sure about the Spanish-American War, and including more people, especially non-white people in America. But the Spanish-American War is typically seen as a widely spread supported war. The rest of these wars, some are not supported at all. Like the Vietnam War is certainly one of our most hated wars. Okay, so let's take these in order. First one, French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. Also known as, of course, the 7 Years' War. Number 2, the Revolutionary War. By the way, I realize 1754 to 1763 is actually 9 years, but 7 Years' War in Europe. It lasts longer here. Number 2, the Revolutionary War from 1776 to 1783. Remember, only about a third of Americans were on board with that. Only about a third of Americans were patriots. The other third were loyalists. The other third just really wanted to stay out of it. Number 3, the War of 1812 from 1812 to 1814. Number 4, the Mexican War from 1846 to 1848. You would think that'd be a pretty popular war because the United States gained all of the Southwest and California because of it. But remember, the transcendentalists really don't like it because it looks like we're expanding more slave land. The Northeast is not really looking forward to it because it looks like, again, we're expanding more slave land. We're gaining more land for slave states. So the Mexican War, even though it really should be a popular war, to some extent, it was not. The Civil War, obviously not overwhelming support there. The proof there are draft riots both in the North and the South. It becomes a very, very unpopular war by the end of it. By the way, 61 to 65 is the Civil War. Number 6, the Spanish-American War, we already talked about. A very popular war, only 9 months. Theodore Roosevelt comes out as a hero in this one. This is 1898. Number 7, World War I from 1917 to 1919. The United States did not want to get in the war. We only got in when we had to, and even then, we were pretty grumpy about it. Number 8, World War II. That is one of our very popular wars, 1941 to 1945. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, very, very unpopular. And number 10, of course, the Vietnam War, extremely unpopular from 64 to 73. And number 11, Desert Storm. You can say that Desert Storm was generally a popular war. We are kicking out Iraq out of Kuwait, and we're protecting the Kuwaitis. More importantly, for some people, we are protecting oil interests in the Middle East. And so that starts out as a fairly popular war. Now, what spins past that is, of course, our involvement in the Middle East, which has not been very popular. That is all 10 reviews. You made it.